Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching History Makers, Voltaire's satire masterpiece by Overly Sarcastic Productions. Now it's been a while since we've done an OSP reaction, but I always really enjoy their videos. And today we get to talk about Voltaire, the most famous Enlightenment thinker, one of your main philosophers of that era, and, judging from the title, we'll be talking about his most famous work, the short novel Candide. A lot of interesting stuff to discuss, but before we get into that, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like on the video, subscribe to my channel, or check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now with all that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
New pins, old pins, so many pins. We're rounding out our Zodiac set with Aries and Pisces, and our back catalog is available for our spring cleaning sale. It's here for the rest of the weekend at our merch site, link below. History is already so dang complicated, sometimes we just want it to make sense, so we love chopping up the timeline into neat little eras. Classical world, medieval, Renaissance, modern. It's nice, it's easy, and it's completely deceptive.
Right, the issue of periodization. As it turns out, history is pretty complex. A lot has happened throughout the history of mankind. And so, to make it easier for ourselves, what we do is we break things down into different periods, different time periods, different eras, right? This is what we call periodization. This is always an issue with historians, a debate among historians, because history, in reality, presents no clear start and end dates for any particular era. Right? History is a continuous series of different events. If you want to make a time period, then you yourself are going to have to choose when it begins and when it ends. Now, we have some time periods that are more generally agreed upon, at least among the popular idea of history among the public, though even some of these time periods like antiquity or the Middle Ages are deeply debated among historians in the academic literature, and each of these periods is going to come with issues, right? The reason we do this is to simplify history, to sort of cut off one period from another period, which is fine because, of course, things change over time. You'll find differences from one year to another, but you'll also find a lot of similarities. So, periodization, a big historical issue, but something we can't really stop ourselves from doing. We want to break down history into different eras, and so we just get to debate over how we do that.
Especially in the case of the Enlightenment. This so-called Age of Reason spanned from the late 1600s through to the end of the 1700s and is largely understood as Europe's intellectual movement away from faff-like religious wars and towards tolerance, science, and reason. On the tin, it suggests an age where people were smart, trying to understand the world more and devise creative ways to make it better. That all did happen, but we can't forget that we're dealing with history, and people are still, well, people.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of debate surrounding the Enlightenment. I mean, some historians suggest that what we know as the Enlightenment didn't even happen at all, that it's part of a broader shift, or that some of the changes that we emphasize did not materialize in the ways we believe. But even if you're not that extreme on the topic of the Enlightenment, there is a lot of debate, as in how popular were these ideas at the time? Were these ideas contained within a sort of reading class that was largely middle and upper class? Did these ideas spread among the people? How impactful were these Enlightenment ideas during that era? Were people reading these Enlightenment tracts and treaties, or were they reading more popular literature? Right? There's a lot of questions. Also, the question of the ideas that we sort of associate with the Enlightenment today. The ideas of sort of freedom, liberty, equality, these types of things. Are those the ideas of the Enlightenment? You know, you can go through a lot of Enlightenment thinkers, and many of them are not really talking about equality and freedom and liberty. A lot of them are writing about very different ideas. Voltaire is an example of someone who may not hold some of the beliefs you'd expect from an Enlightenment character. A lot of these ideas we associate with the Enlightenment are probably more closely associated with the American and French revolutions, which in some ways are sort of a materialization, a culmination of these Enlightenment philosophies, but you'll find a lot of diversity among these different Enlightenment philosophers, right? So a lot of questions, a lot of debate. What was the Enlightenment? When did it happen? Why did it happen? What were the ideas associated with it? How much did it actually change? I mean, there's an incredible debate among the academic literature, among historians, on all these different questions.
Because outside of the academies and hot new treatises about living in a society, the world looked pretty normal, arguably worse. The triangle trade and slavery were still going strong, meanwhile Europe had invented the concept of global war. So while the Enlightenment was an
Right, that's sort of a point there, which ties in with my question about how impactful actually was the Enlightenment, because some historians have pointed out that you may or may not see as sort of a hypocrisy or a tension or a clash, is that during this era that we see as so enlightened, as all these big ideas about freedom and liberty, you also see an explosion of modern global imperialism. I mean, it really sort of begins to kick off with the discovery of the Americas, but the era of imperialism that we see in the 1900s today as well in many ways, that really begins in the 18th century alongside this era of enlightenment, right? So how do you square those? Some people actually don't think these ideas are in tension with each other. There are some who would argue that the Enlightenment project in some ways legitimizes this project of colonization, and there are some who would argue that they do conflict and that you're looking at different threads of history, right? So once again, there's a lot here.
Exciting age of reason for some, it was business as usual for everyone else. Even still, the most celebrated minds of the era were not perfect machines of rational thought, as famed philosophers Voltaire and Rousseau were arguably the most insane people on the continent because of each other.
Yeah, you could find more rational thinkers of that era. Maybe you'd want to turn to a Hume or a Diderot or someone like that, rather than a Voltaire or a Rousseau, who, even just discounting their ideas, these two had pretty interesting personal lives and an interesting relationship between them.
In short, the Enlightenment is not quite a hypocritical period in history, but it's definitely whack, and all the more interesting for it. And one book written by our Parisian pal Voltaire captures this messy spirit of the age better than any other, a little novella by the name Candide.
Yeah, you know what? In some ways, Voltaire really explores this, though he would have viewed a lot of things differently than we do today, but if you want a book that really shows you how messed up the world was at that time, Candide, it does a great job of that. That's kind of one of the points of the book.
Story is a work of philosophy and a satire. It's at once deeply tragic yet unfathomably funny. Candide is the most clever piece of literature this side of the Renaissance, and it's simply one of the best books ever written.
Okay.
So, to understand
big praise
and what compelled Voltaire to compose such a cunning satire and appreciate why it's so dang fun to read, let's do some history. By the middle of the 1700s, Voltaire already had nearly 4 decades of experience writing histories, plays, and treatises on a variety of subjects, and was fabulously wealthy from his brief but lucrative career as a lottery scammer. Despite being banished from his hometown of Paris 2 decades earlier, he had become possibly the most famous writer in the French-speaking world, and had no intention of slowing down. In 1755, Voltaire settled in the Swiss Republic of Geneva, half a town away from his best frenemy Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But that same year, on the far west edge of the continent, away from the epistolary bickering, calamity struck, as the Portuguese capital of Lisbon was flattened by an offshore earthquake that triggered a massive tsunami. Between the 5-meter wide fissures, the building collapses, the fires from falling candles and lanterns, and the gigantic crush of ocean water to top it off, it was an apocalyptic scale of devastation, with as much as a fifth of the city's population dying outright and 10,000 more killed across Portugal and Morocco.
Yeah, I mean, this is a real big event of the era. One of those things that everyone was reading about in the newspapers. The scale of destruction that Lisbon faced was truly sort of incredible scale, and there were some pretty interesting responses to that destruction, I'll put it that way.
Europe was no stranger to suffering, but the Lisbon earthquake was among the worst natural disasters since the plague first struck, so the continent was appropriately freaked the f*** out by it. Confounding the usual attempts to suss out a heavenly cause for the trauma, the quake had struck on All Saints' Day and destroyed every major church in Lisbon, so nobody could make sense of why God would ruin his own feast day or what he was even punishing them for, if indeed this was God's work at all. See, in the early 1700s, the fashionable philosophy of the day was optimism, the belief that our big buddy God made us the optimal world to live in, so everything that happens, however seemingly good or bad, was in service of this perfect or near perfect world.
Right, and you could imagine how an event like that would sort of shake this worldview. And in fact, when I said interesting responses, I'm talking about people being punished and burned in the streets, right? So there's a lot of religious fervor and panic over this event. And this optimism is sort of what Voltaire is going to take on in Candide. In fact, he's directly responding to a philosopher named Leibniz, who was a very popular philosopher of that era, sort of embodies this ideology of optimism. He had this idea that the world we are in is necessarily the best world out of all possible worlds. Now, you may disagree with that, as I do. His ideas have largely been discredited over time, though he did a lot more than just that. I don't want to sell him short. A lot of damage has been done to his reputation, in large part because of Voltaire. So Voltaire is really taking on optimism and Leibniz and these types of ideas in Candide.
The two most famous optimist philosophers were Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who independently discovered calculus at the same time as Isaac Newton.
By the way, that's what I'm saying. He did a lot more than just that, right? So I don't want to sell him short. I feel like Leibniz often gets done dirty in the historical record because Voltaire really clowns him in this book. So I don't want to overshadow his entire legacy, but that optimism, best of all possible worlds idea, that is a part of his ideology that you can't ignore, a big part of it.
And Alexander Pope, best known for his extremely good translations of the Iliad and Odyssey into rhyming English verse. Pope had claimed that what is right, and Leibniz asserted that we live in the best of all possible worlds to square the idea that we don't live in a perfect world free from suffering, but we live in the best world God could possibly create and maintain for us. Both men had died earlier in the 1700s, but their philosophy remained extremely popular even to this day. Not to put too fine a point on it, but this is the same core logic behind God works in mysterious ways, and everything happens for a reason. And while I pride myself on my calm and even-handed coverage of history, Voltaire thought all this blind justification for misery was, in fact, horseshit. He quickly composed a brief 180-line poem on the Lisbon disaster, poking holes in the optimist logic, and mailed a copy to his friend and fellow philosopher Rousseau, who was thoroughly unimpressed. He in turn argued that the real evil was society, packing people so tightly into cities with all those dangling buildings just itching to collapse. But
well, that is a classic Rousseau response. I mean, you can read really a lot of Rousseau's work, and you'll come away with the impression, because this is what he believed, that the moment that people got together and formed societies, it was all over. And Rousseau has this vision of the sort of pre-societal man. He has this vision of an individual, a human, who wandered around the countryside on his own, and it was the most free a human could possibly be. And then people came together and formed society, and basically all ills came from that, right? Rousseau really sees society as the chains that bind us. Now, of course, this is entirely ahistorical in the sense that humans have always been social creatures, even before we were humans. We lived in communities, right? And so, Rousseau's idea is ahistorical. And also, I personally think it's a little silly. I mean, sure, we have a lot of societal ills, but we're going to live together. We're going to be part of societies. But Rousseau is, maybe the sort of archetypical anarcho-primitivist in some ways. He wants to go back to monkey, though he knows that's not possible. I don't want to sell him short. So that's his view on all this. Voltaire comes at it from a different angle.
If people lived in nature instead, everything would have been fine.
Right.
Voltaire didn't respond to his pen pal's claim directly, but we can easily imagine a retort along the lines of, "What? No. What? Forget the buildings, you daft, surprisingly handsome idiot. It's the whole ass tsunami. The water would kill anyone in sight of the coast whether they lived in a city or not. And it did. That's the problem. Not society, you smoochable buffoon. You idiot. God." And
yeah, good summary of the sort of debate between the two. It's funny, Rousseau, I think after Voltaire, Rousseau is probably the second most famous of these Enlightenment philosophers. Maybe, I think he's probably number 2. But funnily enough, Rousseau never saw himself as part of this movement. He really was not a fan of the sort of Enlightenment high society in Paris at that time. He did not have a lot of friends in those circles. In fact, he had a lot of enemies. Now, I will say Rousseau was personally quite a paranoid individual, so that didn't help. but he really saw himself as quite separate from a lot of the thinkers we might put him in a group with today. He probably would not like that. Voltaire, on the other hand, though he was a deeply proud individual who, may not have liked to be in group with anybody, he saw himself as part of this wider movement, and he was a part of the salons and the discussion groups and all this sort of stuff that Rousseau dabbled in, but was quite uncomfortable with, especially in the end.
So the stage is set, with Voltaire at the intersection of the worst calamity in his century, plus the onset of the 7 Years' War, and that philosophy of smug complacency he despised. Naturally, the result was the single funniest book in French history, that little 100-page satire called Candide.
Quite a claim, but it is a funny book, I will say. If you haven't read through Candide, it's absolutely worth the read. I know we're going to sort of, I imagine, summarize it in this video, but it's not a very long book. Won't take you that long. It's pretty readable. You might miss some of the references and the context, but we'll get some of that here. But I definitely recommend giving Candide a read.
Or optimism. The story begins in the perfectly ideal castle of Thunder-ten-Tronckh in Westphalia, at least according to the protagonist Candide anyway. He's only seen one castle, but it has gates and windows, so lacking any other evidence, it's gotta be the best in the world. Candide is an eager young lad, very personable and extremely naive. That outlook is encouraged by his tutor Pangloss, an optimist philosopher who believes that all is for the best in this best of all possible worlds. But as the book will soon reveal, all—
Right, and I don't know if you guys can guess who Pangloss is meant to be a caricature of. It's obviously a satire of Leibniz in particular. Now, maybe some of these figures more broadly, but Pangloss really serves that role of being a Leibniz-type character that allows Voltaire to make fun of him pretty directly.
All is not for the best, as Candide gets booted from the castle for an affair with the Baron's daughter, and he sets on a perilous journey across the world, traversing Europe and crossing the Atlantic to South America before coming back east and finally ending in Ottoman Constantinople. Along the way, he and his gaggle of misfit travel buddies suffer every variety of hardship, from violence to imprisonment to natural disasters, and witness several more. If optimism claims that our world is the best one possible, Voltaire's aim here is to skewer that fallacy with the spear point of satire.
Right. Now, I'd say it's not an incredibly subtle book. The message is pretty obvious, but Voltaire does a good job of illustrating his point, which is the book is essentially following Candide's traveling party as they travel really around the world, seeing the worst atrocities you could imagine from the 18th century, some pretty horrific stuff, and being like, this is fine. And of course, you, as the reader, are meant to take away, okay, this optimist philosophy is very silly because look how horrible everything is.
It's a winning strategy. Why write an overlong critique of a philosophy when you can mock it far more expediently? The wise Dr. Pangloss sagely claims that noses were formed to support spectacles, therefore we have spectacles. Legs are clearly devised for the wearing of breeches, therefore we wear breeches. The reader is thus primed to suspect that Pangloss might, perhaps, be an idiot, so we then infer the rest of his philosophy is just as laughable.
Yeah.
Voltaire obliterates optimism in those first 3 pages, so the remaining 29 chapters are rhetorical overkill. I, for one, am biased to appreciate comedy as a teaching tool, and nobody in history does it better than him. Voltaire spends most of his runtime relentlessly mocking every corner of the world his characters observe, including his beloved hometown of Paris and even himself.
Yeah, I will say, I mean, I've got my own criticisms of Voltaire. He was a pretty deeply elitist type character in many ways, but there's a reason he's so well known, which is he had an incredible writing ability and a very sharp wit. And that is absolutely true of Voltaire, and he really, reading his writings, you can tell, yeah, that wit is very present. He was able to skewer his opponents in service of making his own arguments.
Voltaire jabs at many of his own snobbish opinions about art and literature by putting them in the mouth of a bored Venetian noble who complains about everything. As Candide remarks, what a genius! There is no pleasing him. But Voltaire could do more than mock and parody,
True.
as Candide's journey finally ends with his realization that we must cultivate our garden, accepting that understanding the metaphysics of the universe won't solve our earthly miseries, nor will any amount of money or power. There's no true escape from the horrors of the world, but there is a way to cope. The hard work of quiet, calm self-improvement, rejecting want, rejecting vice. After 29 chapters,
I would say I always sort of didn't like that ending to Candide. I mean, one, because I do not feel like the response to the evils of the world is to turn inwards. And sort of what happens here is at the end of the book, they come to this farm. I believe it's in Ottoman territory. And they find this farmer and his family, and they're very happy. And this guy, he doesn't know about politics and whatever. And the idea, he basically says, we must cultivate our garden, tend to our own farm, to our own affairs, right? The point is, in order to be happy and live a fulfilling life, you should, in many ways, sort of turn away from the world and cultivate your garden, right? Cultivate yourself, self-improvement. Now, there's obviously some truth there. I do believe that if you want to achieve happiness, a lot of that does come from working on yourself. But this idea that you should turn away from the world and the goings-on and everything that's happening, yeah, I don't necessarily agree with that. It also feels very hypocritical coming from Voltaire. This is a man who did not turn away from the world. He was not focused on self-improvement or whatever. Self-improvement was a big Enlightenment ideal. He was someone who was very focused on engaging with the ills and the evils of the world as he saw them and trying to rectify those ills. And I'd say in some ways he had a positive impact in that respect. So I think just taking the idea on face value, there's some good stuff there, but overall I don't necessarily love the ending. We must cultivate our gardens. And then taking it as an idea from Voltaire, it makes even less sense, because this is not a piece of advice he himself took. And I agree with him in that. I think we should take a look at the evils and the ills and the issue with the world, and at least in some small ways, it's worth trying to solve and rectify those issues, even if there's only so much you can do as an individual, and we should be focused on ourselves and our own lives. That's my take, at least.
Of near non-stop torment between natural disasters like the Lisbon quake and man-made atrocities like the 7 Years' War and colonial slavery, this interpretation of Stoic philosophy certainly fits. But also, in addressing Voltaire's own crisis of faith after the IRL Lisbon tragedy, wondering how a loving God could possibly let this happen, this philosophy rings with a genuine sincerity. Now, as with all comedy, to explain the joke is to ruin the joke, so permit me instead a brief taste of Voltaire's prose from Chapter 2, when Candide finds himself press-ganged to fight in the 7 Years' War and is caught trying to leave. He was asked at his court-martial which he preferred, to be flogged by the entire regiment 36 times, or receive 12 lead bullets in his skull simultaneously. In vain did he remonstrate with them about freedom of the will, and protest that he preferred neither one option nor the other. A choice had to be made. He determined, by virtue of that gift of God called freedom, to run the gauntlet 36 times. He endured 2 runs. As they were lining up for the 3rd run, Candide, who could take no more, politely asked if they would instead be so kind as to cave his head in. The plea was granted. Now extrapolate that across the entire book and you've got a sense of why I love this ridiculous little novella so damn much. Voltaire recognized the value of being quick and direct, and that makes it all the more impressive that Candide accomplishes so much. It's an aggressively contemporary snapshot of his world, dialed right into the late 1750s, yet the tone and the feel of the book are surprisingly modern, because the Age of Enlightenment was a complete and total mess, and unfortunately, that's relatable. Living through history is an occupational hazard.
Yeah, and here's the thing, I think some people sometimes take certain eras of history as very precious or beyond reproach, and they don't like when you come to them with hypocrisies or tensions or whatever. What I have to say is that us humans have always been humans. Look around you at the world today. Do you think it's beyond reproach, or do you think there's a lot of issues and hypocrisies and tensions and problems? I think there are. Now, take that and just apply it throughout history. Like I said, we've always been human beings. And no, I don't think it's the fault of society, Rousseau. I think, I don't know if it's, how we are or whatever, but I just know, looking throughout history, we've always been humans doing human stuff, and that can be good, but it can be bad. And history has been very messy. That's pretty clear to me. We've had a lot of issues and a lot of problems, and that has really always been true. So, if you believe the world today contains those things, then the world of the 1700s did as well. And so I think when I'm examining history, I keep that in mind, that these people are humans just like us, and so I examine them on that level, right? I recognize that there were issues and problems, but that they were just people, so they're not beyond reproach, but they're also not demons or anything, right? I think it's a good idea to keep that sort of humanistic perspective in mind when you're analyzing history.
Nobody has ever survived. The question is what we do with our little garden. See, it is a good thing Lisbon got completely obliterated by that earthquake after all. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Candide. Flawless logic. Thank you so much for watching.
Alrighty, another good OSP video. Like I said, I always enjoy their content. I always like talking about Enlightenment stuff. Candide, interesting novel. Like I said, I really would recommend, if you haven't read it, you should go read it now. You know, it's not like, there's still a lot you can see in the book. I guess you sort of got some spoilers, but, understanding the point of the book, I think will just make it more rewarding as you read through. So I think it's still worth reading through. Like I said, it's pretty short. It won't take you that long. So yeah, something very interesting to talk about. I could yap about these Enlightenment guys for hours and hours on end. So I always enjoy getting a chance to do a little bit of that. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and will give you access to regular exclusive content. With all that out of the way, I hope you guys are all having a great day today, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye.